An ordinary day in Peppa Pig's house passed quietly and almost unnoticed. But Peppa herself immediately noticed. Her little brother George was different. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't running around the house like he usually did. Even his favorite dinosaur lay forgotten in the corner, unwanted. George sat by the window, staring into the grey sky, silent. His eyes seemed empty, as if he wasn't looking at anything at all but falling into a bottomless void. "George?" Peppa asked carefully. "Are you all right?" But he didn't answer. He only slowly turned his head to his sister and gave her a faint smile. That smile wasn't warm. It had no joy, no trace of his usual childish innocence. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. At dinner that evening, he barely ate. Their parents tried to talk, but George replied only in single words, or not at all. Peppa noticed that Mummy and Daddy seemed not to see anything strange. They behaved as if George had always been this quiet and distant. Days passed. Each time Peppa found her brother, he was in a different place, out in the garden, by the window, in the hallway, and every time he just sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. His eyes grew emptier with each passing day. Peppa tried to play with him, but he never reacted. Sometimes she caught his stare, long, unblinking, foreign. And then, one evening, Peppa noticed George quietly rise and walk to the door. His steps were slow and steady, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "George, wait!" Peppa called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him. Outside, drizzle filled the air, cold and heavy. George walked straight toward the forest behind their house. Peppa's heart pounded in her chest faster and faster, but she couldn't stop herself. Curiosity and fear pushed her forward. Deep in the woods stood an old hut. Peppa had never seen it before, even though she'd played in these woods many times. The door hung half open and cold air seeped out. George stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, Peppa followed him. Inside, it was dark, smelling of dust and mold. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. George stood in the center of the room. Slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes were utterly lifeless, like two bottomless pits. A wide, unnatural smile was frozen on his face. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered. His voice was low, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Peppa's knees went weak. She stumbled backward, but George melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. The room filled with silence, so heavy that her ears rang. Terrified, Peppa ran out of the hut, tripping and stumbling until she reached home. She burst into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart hammering. But when she looked into George's room, she froze. He was there, sitting on the floor, playing with his blocks, as if nothing had happened. He was even humming a soft tune. "George," Peppa whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were just as empty, his smile just as dreadful. That night, Peppa tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She listened to every sound in the house, and then she heard it. First a faint rustle, then a quiet scraping. It was coming from under her bed. Peppa slowly leaned over and peeked beneath. There sat Labubu, her favorite toy. But now, he didn't look the same. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the window. His smile was stretched far too wide, so distorted it looked as though the fabric of his face had split apart. In his tiny hands, Labubu held a figure. Peppa's heart stopped when she recognized it. It was George, a small, pale copy of her brother with empty eyes and lifeless skin. Labubu raised the figure to his face. His glowing eyes flared brighter, and his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. "He is mine now," he whispered in a low, alien voice. Peppa recoiled, clutching her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed it was only a dream. But when she opened them again, Labubu was still there. In his hands, the figure of George remained. Peppa understood. It was him. It was Labubu who had changed George. He had stolen his soul, and now he wouldn't stop. George was only the beginning. The house grew quiet, too quiet. Even her parents in recent days seemed to have forgotten their younger child. When Peppa asked about him, they only gave her long, blank looks and replied, "We've only ever had you." And in that moment, Peppa realized the most terrible truth. Labubu hadn't just taken George. He had begun erasing him. He was sinking deeper and deeper into their house, into their family, into reality itself. And at night, sitting on the shelf in Peppa's room, Labubu smiled faintly. His red eyes glowed dimly in the darkness, and Peppa knew soon he would come for her too.
Peppa Pig, the mask. It began on a cold, windy day, the kind of wind that pulled at trees and scattered wet leaves across the pavement. The sky had been gray for many days, the park was empty, and the paths were soggy. Peppa and George were walking along a muddy path. Leaves stuck to their boots, and the ground squelched beneath them. Then Peppa saw a white shape lying in the grass. A mask. It lay perfectly flat, as if placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not forgotten. Face up, white, smooth, featureless. Just two dark slits for eyes, and a thin line where a mouth should be, not a smile. Peppa stopped. She bent down, touched it with her hoof. The mask was dry, not cold, as if it had been waiting for her. She pressed it to her face. The mask stuck, silently, effortlessly. At first it seemed like a game, but the mask wouldn't come off. Her hooves slid along the surface, finding no edge, no straps, no seams, nothing. She tugged, pulled harder. It didn't move. The mask had become part of her face. When they returned home, no one reacted, or maybe no one wanted to. The family acted as though nothing had changed, too calm, too quiet. Peppa sat at the dinner table, but her voice sounded muffled, like it was coming through glass. No one looked directly at her. The next day, the mirror behaved oddly. When Peppa turned her head, the reflection lagged behind. When she raised her hoof, the motion was off, as if someone inside the mirror was trying to mimic her but not quite managing. By the third day, she could barely feel her face. The mask didn't press, didn't itch. It simply was, still, silent. She tried to remember her old appearance, but the image blurred like looking through foggy water. Her toys felt unfamiliar. The room looked wrong. Even her favorite blanket smelled different. Her clothes didn't fit right. Everything rubbed, tugged, shifted. She no longer felt at home in her own home. Time passed strangely, day after day, but it meant nothing. The house grew quieter, as if it were absorbing sound. Mummy and Daddy rarely spoke. They were present but distant and fading. Peppa began to hear whispering, not from outside, from within. A whisper without breath, without tone, repeating again and again, "You are the mask. You are me. You were." On the fourth day, the photographs changed. Faces faded. First George, then Daddy, then Peppa herself. The places where eyes and smiles used to be became pale, empty spots. Sometimes the mask itself changed, subtly, narrower, smoother, as if it was adjusting. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw something unfamiliar, something staring back at her from the shadows, always silent. On the fifth day, the room had changed. No windows, walls blank like paper. The air was heavy, like she'd slept for too long. She woke up and didn't recognize anything. Nothing felt familiar, no toys, no books, no sound. In the middle of the floor lay the mask, dry, clean, and no longer on her. She couldn't remember who she was, didn't know why she stood up, didn't feel her own face. In the mirror across the room stood something that resembled Peppa, but the eyes were hollow, and inside them, silence. Peppa was gone. Only the shell remained, only the mask remained, waiting for a new face, a new game. Since then, some days, along the damp paths near the park, the mask can be seen again, lying neatly, dry, clean, and if anyone picks it up, they may hear a soft whisper from within.
Peppa opened her eyes in the middle of the night and immediately realized something had changed. Their cozy room looked unfamiliar. The wallpaper was peeling, the ceiling was cracked, and toys were scattered in the dust. George had also woken up and sat on his bed, sobbing softly. "Peppa, this isn't our house," he whispered, clutching his dinosaur. The silence was so thick it rang in their ears. And then it broke. In the living room, the television hummed to life. They both knew no one had turned it on. The screen flickered with static, distorting the darkness of the room. Peppa carefully led her brother by the paw downstairs. The living room looked even worse. The floor was stained with damp spots. The furniture creaked as if it had been standing for hundreds of years. Jagged lines and blurry silhouettes danced across the screen. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa called, but only a distorted, heavy voice replied, "You have been happy for too long. Now it's time to pay." George clapped his hands over his ears in horror, while Peppa stepped closer. Two glowing spots appeared on the screen. One cold blue, the other warm orange. From these patches of light, shapes began to take form. Their bodies looked as though they were built from blocks, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. "It's Los Bros," Peppa whispered. "We've come," they said in unison. Their voices sounded as if they came from both the television and directly inside her head. At that moment, Peppa noticed the mirror on the wall. She looked into it and froze. Staring back at her was herself, but twisted. Her eyes were enormous and black, her mouth stretched into a wide grin, and behind her reflection stood two figures, one blue, one orange. Peppa screamed. George, terrified, ran toward the door and suddenly vanished. His cry echoed through the empty house before silence fell again. "George!" Peppa shouted. She dashed through the rooms, opening every door, but their house was no longer a home. Corridors stretched endlessly, windows looked out into black emptiness. On the floor lay George's dinosaur. The toy was dirty, marked with strange stains, blue and orange prints, as though someone had gripped it with both hands. Peppa's heart pounded. She picked up the toy and heard laughter. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her. The laughter was childlike and cheerful, yet there was something tortured within it. The television flared again, and now the figures of Los Bros appeared clearly. On the left stood Tralalerit, his aura glowing blue, eyes burning with a cold gleam. His grin was so wide it seemed it might tear his face apart. On the right stood Tung Tung Tungsito, bathed in orange light. His movements were sharp, his stare piercing, as if he could see straight through her soul. "Where's George?" Peppa cried, though her voice trembled. "He's with us," one answered. "Now it's your turn," added the other. A stream of black smoke burst from the television. It whirled into a vortex, and the entire house began to change. The floor cracked, the walls bent and warped, the ceiling sank lower. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt as heavy as stone. The shadows on the walls came alive, stretching into hands that clawed at her dress. She tore herself free, but standing before her now were Los Bros themselves. No longer on the screen, but in the room. Their blocky bodies seemed alive, yet their eyes were alien. Blue and orange light intertwined, wrapping around everything. Peppa felt her breathing grow heavier, her heart tighten in her chest. "We will play," they said in unison. "Forever." They stepped closer. The floor beneath her feet vanished, and Peppa fell into a crimson void. The last thing she saw were their faces grinning in the darkness, and their hands reaching out to her. And then the house sank into silence. Only in the forest, near their home, one can sometimes hear children's laughter and a faint whisper carrying two voices, one blue, one orange. At night, Peppa opened her eyes. The house felt strange. The ceiling was cracked, the walls were damp, and the air was heavy and cold. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, but it sounded wrong, like someone whispering. George was sitting nearby. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "George, what's wrong?" Peppa asked. He silently pointed toward the door. A dim light flickered in the hallway. Peppa carefully climbed down from her bed and followed her brother. The house was empty. There were no smells of Mummy Pig's cooking. The TV in the living room was off, and beyond the windows there was no garden, only endless fog. They walked slowly. The floorboards creaked under their feet and water dripped from the ceiling. When Peppa opened the bathroom door, she froze. Where the mirror used to hang, there was now a door, narrow, blue, as if painted right onto the tiles. "It wasn't here before," Peppa whispered. George stepped closer, reached out his little hoof, and touched the handle. The door opened. No creak, no sound. Just silently swung inward into a thick blue darkness. A cold draft came from within. George stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him. Peppa was left alone. She knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, the door opened again. George came out, covered in dust, as if he'd been somewhere ancient. His eyes looked empty. "Where were you?" Peppa asked. He whispered, "There, blue rooms." And a shadow. It's waiting Peppa didn't understand. George went to bed, but all night he tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. The next night, it happened again. The blue door appeared once more, and again, only George could open it. Peppa tried to grab his hoof, but her touch passed through the air, as though the door existed only for him. When he returned, his fur was no longer dusty but covered in soot. His eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light. He didn't want to talk. Only sometimes, he whispered, "La Boo Boo is inside." He's watching. Peppa began to notice strange things. The shadows in the corners of the room started to move on their own. The water in the sink looked dark, like a mirror. When she called George, he turned his head slowly, as if unsure who was speaking to him. "George, it's me, your sister," she said quietly. One night, Peppa woke up to the sound of footsteps. George was standing by her bed. His eyes shone with a cold blue light. In them, Peppa saw not their room, but a reflection of rippling water, as if inside his gaze was a river. In that murky water, shapes were moving. Peppa gasped. George smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "He's calling," he whispered. "He wants you to come too." Peppa ran to the bathroom. The blue door was there again, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Moist air flowed from it, and on the floor shimmered a trembling reflection, like the surface of water. She didn't go closer. She knew if she opened it, she wouldn't come back. The next morning, the door was gone. Only a damp wall remained, and a dark hoofprint mark on the floor. George sat on his bed, calm, as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" she asked. He smiled. "I'm already home." But when Peppa looked into his eyes, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection of the room, a blue shadow shaped like La Boo Boo, sliding across his pupil before vanishing. Since then, Peppa has never seen the blue door again. But every night, when the house grows too quiet, somewhere deep within the walls, there comes a soft sound, as if someone is turning a blue handle once more. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. At first, she thought it was just darker because of the rain, but soon she realized the darkness was different, too thick, too still. Even the air didn't move. She listened. No sound of George's breathing, no rain, no wind, only the dull thud of her own heartbeat. Peppa got out of bed. The room looked strange. The shapes of things seemed to blur, as if the light had forgotten how to touch them. George's bed was neatly made, the pillows smooth, untouched. "George?" she called softly. No answer. The house was silent. As she walked down the hallway, Each step echoed faintly, as if the floor below was hollow. In every room, the beds were perfectly made. No toys, no wrinkles, no sign of life. In the kitchen, the plates were clean, the table shining, and there was no smell, no warmth, as if no one had ever lived there. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa's voice trembled. Only a dull echo came back from the dark. Peppa went to the window. There was no garden, no road, no streetlight. Only blackness, not night, but something else. It moved, flowed, alive. She opened the front door. Cold air hit her face, but it had no scent, no earth, no rain. Before her stretched an endless void. The town was gone. Puddles, hills, houses, everything replaced by a shimmering darkness that rippled like liquid smoke. She took a step forward. The ground beneath her vanished, yet she was still standing, as if the darkness itself held her up. She turned. The house was gone. Only her small shape hung in the void, surrounded by an endless breathing night. Then she saw it. At first, only movement, a faint ripple in the distance, then a shape. From the depths emerged a figure, small, elongated, its limbs thin, its eyes too dim, glowing lights. Labubu. He moved slowly, but the space between them seemed to shrink on its own. Each step sent a vibration through the air, as if the whole world tightened with him. "Where is my family?" Peppa whispered. Labubu stopped. His eyes were empty, no pupils, no life, yet something ancient flickered within them. From the depths of the blackness came a sound, not words, but a rhythm, like breathing, and the darkness seemed to whisper, they did not vanish, they became part of it. Peppa stepped back, but there was nothing behind her. The darkness touched her, slipping under her skin, seeping into her breath. The cold spread inside, not through her body, but deeper, where fear lives. For a moment, the house appeared again, ghostly, distorted. Walls made of mist, windows without light. In them stood 4 motionless figures with empty faces. They looked at Peppa, but did not recognize her. Then everything vanished again. Labubu stood beside her. His breathing was deep and steady. Each exhale extinguished the last traces of sound. Peppa felt her own voice dissolving, turning into a whisper, then fading into nothing. The world was collapsing quietly. No light, no cry. First, the horizon disappeared, then the air, then her own shadow. Labubu raised his paw and touched her shoulder. The space around them cracked like thin glass. From the fracture spilled a cold, silver light. It illuminated the two of them, Peppa and Labubu, and all else was gone. Now, they stood in nothingness. No up, no down, no time. Peppa didn't move. She didn't know if she was breathing or dreaming. Her reflection was gone. Only he remained. Labubu looked straight at her. In his eyes, she saw the town, dead, colorless, covered in ash. Where laughter once lived, only the wind wandered now. Peppa understood. He hadn't come. He had always been here. The darkness was him. The house, the town, everything. Only his breath. And now, with everything gone, he was no longer alone. In the endless night, where there is no beginning and no end, only two remained. Peppa and Labubu. And the world that once was became a whisper, fading forever into the black silence. In Peppa's room, there had always been one familiar window looking out onto the garden. But one morning, she noticed something new. On the wall beside her bed, there was now another window. Narrow, with a cracked frame and dim, misted glass. It looked old, as if it had been there for many years, though it had never been there before. Peppa stepped closer. Beyond this window, there was no familiar yard or swings. Instead, a dark forest stretched out, wrapped in grey fog. Tall trees rose upward, their branches intertwining into black patterns. In the distance, among the trunks, stood a figure. It was motionless, yet in its outline there was something alive. The next day, the figure was closer. Through the mist, Peppa could make out sharp ears, huge round eyes, and a smile too wide to be real. It was Labubu. His silhouette grew darker and clearer, and it seemed that each day he took another step closer to the window. Peppa tried to tell Mummy Pig, "Mummy, there's a new window in my room. There's a forest outside it, and someone is standing there." But as soon as Mummy walked into the room, the second window vanished. The wall was ordinary again. "You must have dreamed it, Peppa," Mummy Pig said, patting her daughter's head before leaving. That night, however, Peppa woke again to see the window had returned. In the fog, Labubu stood much closer. His eyes glowed yellow, and Peppa felt the cold from his gaze spread through the room. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, but still couldn't fall asleep. Each morning, the figure was nearer. On the third day, Labubu stood almost at the forest's edge, his long arms stretching forward as if trying to touch the glass. Peppa called her mother again, but the window disappeared the moment she entered. "Enough of this imagination," Mummy Pig said firmly. "There's nothing wrong in your room?" But Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. On the fourth night, a strange sound woke her. From the window came a faint scratching, like claws dragging across glass. Terrified, Peppa watched as the shadowy figure in the mist lifted its head. Labubu was right there now. His glowing eyes stared directly at the level of her bed. In the morning, marks appeared on the glass of the second window, as though someone had scraped it with sharp nails. And at the bottom corner, words were etched, carved from the inside. "You look through the window, but I am inside." Peppa's heart sank. She ran to fetch her mother and tried to show her the writing, but when they returned, the window had vanished again. That night, Peppa didn't go to sleep. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the wall where the window would appear. When the clock hands passed midnight, it returned. Labubu was now standing directly behind the glass. His smile was wider than ever. He didn't move, but Peppa could clearly hear a whisper in her head. "Open the window. I'm waiting for you." She gripped the windowsill tightly, trying not to move. In the silence, she heard only her own breathing, shallow and uneven. Suddenly, the glass trembled slightly, as if someone was pressing against it from the forest side. Peppa screamed, and in that instant, everything vanished. The room was ordinary once more. Only a small, damp sprig of pine needles lay on the floor. Now, every morning, Peppa wondered if the second window would appear again, and every night, it did. Labubu was closer each time, and Peppa knew. One day, he would no longer remain behind the glass. Late at night, Peppa and George were still awake. They sat on the floor of their bedroom, building a tower out of blocks and laughing. Outside stretched the darkness, the wind rustling through the branches of the trees. But suddenly the room grew colder. At first, just a faint draft, then an icy current of air that made the toys on the shelves begin to sway. "Peppa, I'm scared," George whispered. The toys began to move. Cars rolled across the floor on their own. The teddy bear lifted its paw, and a doll tilted its head so sharply that its neck cracked. Peppa pulled her brother close and felt the walls begin to change. The drawings on the wallpaper came alive. Flowers stretched into black, writhing lines like shadows, creeping slowly upward. The bedroom door creaked and swung open. A silhouette appeared on the threshold. It looked like Daddy Pig, but twisted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. His body was covered with green growths, like avocados, and his arms were massive and powerful, like those of a gorilla. His eyes glowed a dim red. This was the avocado gorilla. He leaned forward and spoke in a deep voice. "Let's play a game. Stay absolutely still until morning. Any movement, and you lose." Peppa and George froze where they were. In the corridor behind him appeared the figures of Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig. But they were not their parents. Their faces were lifeless, their smiles too wide, and their eyes were empty, black voids. They stood motionless, staring directly at the children. The house began to distort. The ceiling rose higher, the walls stretched, and new doors appeared, doors that had never been there before. One opened on its own, revealing only fog and the sound of heavy footsteps. The air grew thick and cold, and the lamp overhead flickered as if it were breathing in rhythm with Peppa's heart. "I can see you," the avocado gorilla said, his voice echoing as if from inside the house itself. "Whether you stand still, whether you breathe too loudly, I will notice." George gripped his sister's hand so tightly, Peppa's fingers turned white. She didn't dare move. It seemed the shadows on the walls were watching them, waiting to catch even the slightest twitch. Minutes dragged on endlessly. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sounded like thunder. Time itself felt frozen. Peppa knew that if she flinched even once, the game would end, and the end would be terrible. When the clock hands finally crept past dawn, the figures began to fade. The avocado gorilla slowly dissolved like smoke. The shadows sank back into the walls, and the drawings on the wallpaper turned ordinary again. The room returned to normal, but Peppa and George knew it hadn't been a dream. It was a test. The next morning, their parents acted as if nothing had happened. Mummy made breakfast. Daddy read his paper. Peppa wanted to ask about the night, but stayed silent. They remembered nothing. Or maybe they simply didn't want to. A day later, the family went to Grandpa Pig's farm. Peppa was excited about the trip, but unease gnawed at her. From the very moment they approached, she noticed everything was different. The trees seemed taller than before, their branches weaving into a heavy canopy. The ground was soft, almost damp, and every step released the smell of rot. The farm was silent. The usual chatter of animals was gone. The barn was empty, the shed stood open, but inside there wasn't a sound. Even the ducks on the pond sat motionless, like statues. Grandpa Pig greeted them with a smile, but his eyes were strange. In them glowed the same red light Peppa had seen in the avocado gorilla. "Welcome," he said. "Today we'll play a game too." The family stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by fog. The houses and trees around the farm seemed to blend together into one vast living creature. Peppa felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and in that trembling she heard the familiar breathing of the avocado gorilla. She squeezed George's hand and realized the game was not over. Their home, their farm, their world, it had already changed. The avocado gorilla was watching them, and now he was everywhere.